Lights Inside the Tunnel, a podcast where we take an intersectional and interfaithful look at social justice. I'm your host, Fiona, and this is episode 3, Immersion and Intersectionality. Now, if you've tuned into our prior episodes, you'll know that I usually introduce this podcast as something that looks at social justice in the time of social distancing. This week, we're doing things a little bit differently. We're going to instead look at social justice when we didn't have to be at least 6 feet away from the margins at all times. Taking a little trip down memory lane for you all, and then we're going to look at how we can use these memories to perform social justice while social distancing. Welcome back to Lights Inside the Tunnel. I am so excited for today's episode. I just want to jump in and introduce our many special guests today, and then we'll talk a little bit about why today's episode is very exciting and also a little bit different from the other 2 episodes you've already listened to. So our guests today are a collection of different people who've gone on the service immersion trips this past year through campus ministry. And I just want to introduce them to you now. So first we have Mia Petronio and Luke Ginta, who went to the New Mexico service immersion trips. Hi, Mia and Luke. How are you guys?
Wonderful.
Hi, Fiona.
And then we have the lovely Grace Adams, who went to El Salvador.
Hi.
Hi, Grace. And then last but not least, we have Mike Gerard and Kelly Tierney, who went to Jamaica.
Hello.
Hey, everyone.
All right, welcome to the podcast, guys. I'm really glad you're all here. I'm really excited for this. So today what we're doing is we're doing something called, for our listeners who don't know, it's called Stories of Solidarity. It's an event that Moyne hosts every spring semester where we have students that went on the service immersion trips come and talk about their experiences, and usually there's a free meal involved. Obviously, we couldn't do that right now because we are all sadly off campus, but this is also something that the student body and community really loves, so we wanted to kind of preserve the beauty of this tradition and practice by converting it to a podcast form. All right, so I'm sure you're all done listening to me just kind of blab, and we're probably gonna get right into it. So I have never gone on a service immersion trip, so this is going to be like really fun for me just in terms of like learning so much, because I definitely want to go on one. But I understand that there's a difference between mission trips, which some schools send their students on, and then service immersion trips. Can anyone like tell me what's the deal with that difference, why it's important? Grace.
Yeah, I can definitely shed some light there. I think the something that is a really big difference in the two is like the difference between charity versus solidarity. And that is something that I know like Moyne campus ministry has really worked on implementing, in that you don't want to come into another community and leave, like just do work and leave. Instead, you want to come in and learn the injustices facing that community, so that you can be a better ally to them in trying to work against the injustices that they're facing.
I think that's really interesting and important.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I was still on mute. Yeah, it's definitely like a really. I think it's a really influential way, like to make connections with people, as well as really work towards striving for like a more just sort of society.
I love that. So I've also heard that there are 4 cornerstone values that, because you guys all get together, right? Like, and you have meetings before the trips. Everyone's nodding. Listeners can't see that, but I can see it. So I don't know, do you guys just want to like throw out some of the cornerstone values, like popcorn it, just go for it? Luke, you want to take one? Do you remember them?
Remember them. I'm sorry. I think I can help out a little bit with that.
Mike.
So,
I know the 4 cornerstone values, and I think Grace is probably going to be the best one to correct me if I'm wrong. Spirituality, simplicity, solidarity, social justice.
I thought it was those.
Mike, that was
10 out of
perfect.
10.
That was perfect.
I have a little cheat sheet, which is an email from Grace pulled up right here, so I was able to see that. All right.
I remember seeing those recently, and they were sitting back there somewhere. So running with Grace kind of hit a little bit on spiritual or solidarity. I'm sorry, but just the first idea there is just being with people and being in communion with them. Being from a Jesuit school, there's this idea of being men and women for, but also with others.
Yeah.
And that solidarity is that you gotta be in communion with other people to really understand them and understand their circumstances. And that's that cornerstone values. So.
Yeah, that's really well said. Thanks, Mike. Mia, so you've been on 2 service trips now, right? You went to New Mexico last year as well, if I remember correctly.
Right.
What does simplicity mean just to you in terms of that kind of the service immersion work?
So I think we went there with, well, Alice provides us a packing list, and it's very, very small. We can only bring 1 bag, and we tend not to use our phones while we're there. So we're really like physically going there, with just simply kind of what we're bringing. And we're there to help people who are also like living this simple life. And I think that we left feeling, I don't know, like Luke kept saying this trip, live in the moment. And it was just something so simple that he kept saying, but it really struck with the rest of the group. And we kept, thinking about what we were doing in the moment rather than what was going on at home. And yeah, I really liked that he kept saying that throughout the trip.
Well, and you guys were there over spring break, so I'm sure I for people who don't really know, like to kind of layer this idea of simplicity, living in the moment, coronavirus was just escalating while you guys were over there. And I talked to Alice, like you guys weren't sure if you were going to get home, like things were all up in the air with school. How did this and Luke, you can jump in here too if you want, like how did that live in the moment kind of root you in such a time of anxiety, but to remind you kind of like of what you were there to do?
I think like when I was there, like I put my phone away and like I tried to be 100% there with the people that we were, serving with and talking with and like learning from. And one of the like top moments, I mean, Mia could say this too. I mean, everybody's favorite moment from that trip, I think, was when we went to this restaurant called Ben Michael's.
Mm-hmm.
And we knew we were coming home. It was the night before we left and we wanted to go out having fun, So we went to this restaurant. It was like a final dinner. And then this place, they had like a live jazz band. And the host would sing to us and he gave us food and the whole place got filled. Everyone was singing and dancing and like it was just us and them, us and like the people we were with in that just, I don't know, like solid 3 hours, and it was just like bliss,
Yeah.
And I mean, the whole week was very like, I forgot about everything before the trip. It was only like 3 days or 4 days, but it felt like a month in a good way,
Mm-hmm.
And like, I got so much closer to the people that I was with, and then the people that I also interacted with. Like we went to St. Edwin's Church, and I loved talking to Father Pete, his name was, and then some of the local parishioners. They were really cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and then we went to this local farm. I forget what the name of the farm was. Do you remember, Mia?
Los Jardines?
Yeah.
Institute. Yeah. So we knew the night before we were leaving that we were kind of leaving. Nobody was saying it, but it was just understood. And yeah, for those of you that don't know, our trip was cut short, 2 or 3 days?
Yeah, 3,
but
I think.
We still made the most out of every day that we were there. And we got to serve all of the people that we were there to serve. And we got to meet wonderful people. And we really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I love you guys talking about simplicity in that way, because I think that really connects back to Mike's definition of solidarity, just in the sense of like living in communion with other people. Kelly, do you want to talk a little bit about what spirituality meant for you on your trip to Jamaica?
Yeah, I think this one was a little different for me on our trip. I don't know. I think really what they're focusing here also ties back with solidarity in a way, and you know, being able to pray with people, which is something that we did a lot, and just maybe more so about reflection in our circumstance when we were in Jamaica. And that's something that we did every day. And I guess something else that we did every day that was, for me, tying back to that cornerstone value was reflecting every night on the experiences that resonated with us the most during the day, and kind of having a discussion with each other about that.
Yeah. So I don't know if you guys did this ever, but I've gone to Catholic school my entire life. And multiple times I've had to fill out this like worksheet, I don't know, for like different religion classes where it's like, what kind of, it's basically like the Enneagram or like Myers-Briggs for religion. And it's like, oh, what kind of like spirituality do you practice? Like, I think it's like vertical, like are you very like about going to mass and that kind of thing? Is it are you very internal, like is it all like very close within your heart, or are you a horizontal person where you kind of just like live out your faith by how you interact with others? And I think that's like very Jesuit in the sense that, not that like we don't go to church and we don't, you know, pray and have like nourish our soul, but I think that the whole idea about like being Jesuit educated is like seeing faith regardless of what that faith is, because I know a lot of people of different faith practices go on these trips, of no faith practice go on these trips, but just like this idea that, you know, we live out goodness and kindness by how we treat the world and each other. Do you think that's like a fair assessment of these kinds of trips?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I think most of where I felt my spirituality throughout the experience was being able to connect with so many people. And I think that definitely, yeah, with what you were saying with like the horizontal spirituality, I think that's definitely something that we were acting out the entire trip.
Yeah, that's really great. So Luke and Mia told us a little bit about what they did in New Mexico, and I'll come back to that. But Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about what the purpose was of the Jamaica trip, what kind of work you guys did there, what communities you were going to involve in?
So, in my opinion, the main purpose of the trip was more of an immersion trip than straight up service, but it was definitely a combination of the two. So our service aspect was more oriented toward education. So our beginning half of the week we spent with students at the primary schools in Jamaica. And so those are kids from anywhere. I mean, I think we had as young as 2 up to about 6 or 7, but primarily 3 to 5-year-olds. And so we got to go and see how they had classes a little bit there, hang out with them during their recess times. One thing that seemed to be a favorite for a lot of people on the trip was their devotion time. I don't know about you guys, but in grade school, we always had to stand up. We always, did the Pledge of Allegiance. They get a group of kids outside. They sing the Jamaican national anthem. They always said hello to all of their teachers and to all of us. So that was the beginning half of the week, but we also spent time at an HIV/AIDS clinic and talked to the people there. We spent time at a elder care center. We split up and did different jobs there. We spent time with boys from a school called St. John Bosco, and what happened at that school was for boys who tended to get in a little bit more trouble, who had been kicked out of the other schools, suspended indefinitely, and who couldn't return to schools where they would typically go until they finished a period of time at St. John Bosco, or other boys would just be there permanently. And they taught trades there. They taught classes there. Some of the boys lived on the campus. They cooked us a dinner actually 2 different nights they cooked us a dinner. So we had our service. We had where we would go out and see different groups of people and meet different groups of people in Jamaica, but also we had this immersion into the community in Mandeville, which is where we were. We went to mass twice at the cathedral that was there. We spent a day working at the cathedral, and then every night we were hanging out with the cook that lived on the campus where we were living. make us dinner. So every night we got to go in and see her for a little bit. The groundskeeper would come and play games with us. We got to have a great relationship with our local van driver. He actually one day took us to this awesome spot near his house, showed us where he lived. So it wasn't just about the service. It wasn't just about the immersion. It was an all-encompassing trip for all of it. And, you know, a little bit of everything, working with kids, working all the way up through an elder care center, you know, hanging out and playing games to scraping and painting at the cathedral. So we did a little bit of everything in Jamaica.
That's awesome, and it really sounds like you guys really became members of the community, if only for a little bit of time. That's awesome. Grace, I know the El Salvador trip also prioritizes immersion and connections and community building. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that trip?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the El Salvador trip, we actually only spent time like in community building and connections. We didn't do any service while we were there. The trip was really a lot of meeting with people as well as organizations that are trying to relieve El Salvador of its injustices that really came out of like years and years and years of history, but more recently their civil war, which occurred about 40 years ago, and really has a real stain on the country because of the amount of deaths that occurred in their civil war. It was the trip was really wonderful, but it was definitely hard in a lot of ways because you had to kind of let go of many preconceived notions, any sort of things you thought you knew, and let go of that and listen to the people that experienced this violence in their life, and even the generational violence of, they talked a lot about like, children whose parents lived through the war and experienced that sort of violence and grief that comes with that, and how they have carried that as well. So it was a lot of listening while also validating people's experiences and stories, which is something they also talked about in El Salvador, that the people who were affected by the war, their experience most of the time has really not been validated, especially by their government. It has not been validated, which really carries a lot of heartache, I think. And so it was really important that we were there and that we were listening and validating the people talking to us about what they've experienced in their life and how it's affecting them today in so many aspects. In just like poverty and in their unemployment and immigration, like so many issues it encompasses. So yeah, that was a really, really important aspect of the trip. We also were able to go into different communities. One community was El Papaturo, which was a rural community that was so much fun. It was 3 days, and it was a like self-sustaining community of about 400 people that was created after the war ended. And it was really cool to me. It was kind of a way for people to be together so that they could kind of grieve together and share their experiences together and live in a community where that was being like talked about and validated, and which was really interesting to me. So yeah, it was really cool that we were able to speak to so many people that were really working hard on trying to alleviate a lot of the sadness and the injustice that has occurred, while also showing us too about what a great and beautiful culture that is there too, and having appreciation for that as well, which is something that you don't hear a lot about El Salvador. If you Google El Salvador, like everything that comes up is about gangs, gang violence, which is a huge issue. But it was also really wonderful, I felt, to be able to also see the sort of community and culture that is being built there, and has been there for forever.
Yeah, that was so beautifully said. Thank you. I really like this idea of showing up and validating communities. Mia, do you want to tell us a little bit about what communities you guys showed up for and validated in New Mexico? Just in the sense that I feel like some people, El Salvador, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, like sometimes those places feel so far from us because we are socially distant from, not in the socially distant sense of like 6 feet apart, but just like sometimes like these communities feels worlds away. But New Mexico, I think a lot of people have been there throughout their lifetime, and they might not expect that that is a place that you go to immerse yourself in communities and perform acts of service. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Right. So last year's trip, when I went to New Mexico, we actually got to host 22 refugees who were traveling from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico. And they just happened to be traveling when we went. It wasn't planned. And Father Graham, who was a man that we were staying with at the Abbey, he welcomed them with open arms, and he housed them, he sheltered them for 2 days when they were seeking asylum in the United States. So for 2 days we went to Walmart and we bought them cell phones and clothes and toys because there were like infants with them, and it was just the saddest, just most heartbreaking, experience to see them. And I think a lot of people don't realize that they traveled through New Mexico, seeking asylum. And Father Graham bought them, train tickets and bus tickets. And I met a mother and a son who were traveling from Mexico to Florida because that's where they had family, and they had to take, a bus and another bus and another bus to get there, and they don't speak English. So it was just really hard. Father Graham is a wonderful man, and he set up their transportation and their shelters, and it was comforting to see that he was helping people in need in a time like this, and especially with our current political climate, we definitely need people like him to help, these refugees who are seeking asylum.
Yeah, and did you hear any stories about from the refugees about why they were seeking asylum?
So a lot of them, they can't find work where they are, or for the mother and son that we met, Maria and Oliver, they were in an abusive household, and they had to, escape that living situation, and this was their only way out. And they had a year from the time they got to Florida, so it's been a year now. They had to meet with a judge and find a sponsor in order to stay home. And unfortunately, we aren't in contact with them anymore, but I'm hoping for the best.
Yeah. So Kelly, can you tell us a little bit about Grace and Mia have both hit on like this idea that sometimes we have like certain expectations and preconceived notions about these communities. Can you tell us a little bit about what surprised you about Jamaica, and what you think that like we get wrong about people in Central America?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's kind of funny because a lot of us that were on our trip were actually talking about how, when you tell people that you're going to Jamaica, a lot of the times, unlike some place like El Salvador, people are like, oh, you're going on a vacation. So that's something that we got a lot from parents and just stuff like that, of people assuming that, everything was fine and dandy there, which a lot of the times it is. But I think we were kind of surprised by like the attitudes that everybody had there. That's something that shocked me, is there is a lot of poverty there, but the attitudes that those people have are just so uplifting, and I think they definitely imparted those like attitudes onto us, and that's something that a lot of us got out of the trip.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I want to build on that and kind of also go back to what you were saying before, Mike. You were talking about how you really got involved with just about every community there in terms of, you worked with little kids, you worked with the elderly, you went into an HIV/AIDS clinic. And I know you also went to a Jesuit high school. And something that I really like about the Jesuits is I feel like they're willing to go into spaces that a lot of other people in specifically the Catholic Church aren't willing to go in. Can you talk a little bit about just the importance of, going into those, having the ability to go into those spaces, and showing up for all people on the margins, not just some of the people on the margins?
Yeah, I can do that. When we were talking about the 4 cornerstone values earlier, one of the ones we didn't really talk about very much was the social justice cornerstone. And a big part of that and a big part of these trips is we are going to be with people who are on the margins. And that's a big thing, is you have to meet the marginalized on the margins. They're not able to come to you. So I actually went on a service immersion trip in high school. And I was in Louisville, Kentucky, and I was working with asylum seekers, refugees, and other people who were displaced from places such as Cuba, Central America, the continent of Africa, and also the Middle East. So I did that in high school. I did that going into my senior year of high school. Now in my junior year of college, I was able to go to Jamaica and see another marginalized, be with and see how these people who, according to the society that we live in the United States, are poor or aren't as well off as us. But generally what we tend to see is that when we go, we don't give anything to these people. We go and we show up, but they give us so much more than we can ever give them. So the experiences we have inform our future decisions. So I think that's part of the idea of social justice, part of the idea of meeting people on the margins and going to the marginalized. You go out, you be with the people, you understand their circumstances, so that down the line, we can make informed decisions that might better the situations of those people. And being Jesuit educated, it's more than just preparing us for a job. It's preparing us to have a career that is in service to something that is important for us. I know Luke is very much into environmental sustainability, and I know that a lot of the education he's getting at Le Moyne is pushing him toward being able to forward environmental sustainability, not just in New Jersey, not just at Le Moyne, but I personally think Luke's going to have a huge impact in other places. And maybe other people who are going on these trips want to be poli-sci or going for poli-sci degrees. And I know Maddie Cittadino went on a trip this year, and she wants to do criminal law, and I'm pretty sure she wants to be a public defendant.
Yeah.
So the thing is these trips, we go to see these people and be with them, not because we want to bring and do good for them now. The goal is to better their situations later. That's the idea of social justice. That is one of those cornerstone values of Jesuit education, because we want to not perpetuate these systems that are going to keep people in these situations for any longer than they have to be.
Right. I think you bring up so many good points there, and you also, I'm so glad you kind of set up exactly where I was going to transition to next. So I feel like we all got a brain meld going on here, which is awesome. So I think that and that goes back to Grace's earlier point about how this is justice work, not charity work, in the sense that we're not showing up in these spaces to provide pity, because pity is, oh yeah, go ahead, Grace. Grace, go.
Sorry.
Everyone.
I had kind of just had a thought that's going off a lot of what Mike said and what you're going into, but something I had remembered that really stuck with me coming home from El Salvador was we went through an organization called CRISPAS, and the director of CRISPAS would come meet us usually every night back at our hotel to kind of talk and do a little bit of a reflection. And I remember when we had gotten home or back to San Salvador from El Papaturo, we had all gone around and talked about our experience. And something that I remember him saying was how he was like, you cannot romanticize poverty, and that poverty like must be destroyed, and like we have to work towards that. And I thought that was a really good point that Mike kind of went on with social justice, and that it is really different in that you are leaving that area with a new sense of what justice means, and helping that to inform your own decisions so that you can work to end that, instead of maybe doing something more like I'm trying to think of the word, but something like charity, or like trying to really alleviate that like main issue that creates those sort of like poverty and things like that.
I saw a lot of people nodding. Does anyone else want to like jump in and say anything about this? Okay, so I think so I'll transition into kind of something else that I was hoping to talk about, but I think to kind of again go, not to exactly repeat what was just said, but I think that there's this, I think Grace used the word eradication, which is really important, just in the sense that if you go to a place and you provide labor, or you donate money, or you show up for like a week, nothing systemically changes. It's a Band-Aid over a bullet wound, in the sense that, and Mike brought up this idea that, when you show up to the margins and then you return back to your place of privilege, you're able to use your knowledge from the margins to inform the decisions that you make throughout the rest of your life. And so Julia Walsh was one of the first people we had on the podcast, and she's also been on a service immersion trip. And she likes to use this phrase called contextualizing privilege, just in the sense that like we can all use our privileges and weaponize it to dismantle systems of oppression, which I think is really interesting. And I was also glad that Mike brought up Luke and environmental sustainability, which we did talk a little bit about on last week's episode. But something that you guys have all been talking about a little bit is this idea of displacement, and how displacement is something that affects all communities, and it's what often brings people to the United States. Luke, do you want to talk a little bit about like environmental displacement, both in terms of New Mexico and just like in your own expertise?
So one of the things we talked about in New Mexico was environmental racism. When we were at Los Jardines, right, Mia? Yeah. The leader there, what was her name? I'm sorry, I keep forgetting her name.
Sophia?
Yeah, Sophia. She talked about how certain policies in like the local government, and how I believe it was how the distribution of water was carried over land, it favored certain farmers over others, and it put Chicano farmers and I believe Pueblo farmers at a certain disadvantage, and that was kind of some of the stuff that we learned about in New Mexico. We also learned about we also learned about a landmark law case. The Pueblo people sued, I believe it was the city of Albuquerque, or it was maybe the state government, for water access, and they actually won like an incredible amount of money. I think it was like $11 million, because of the way the Rio Grande River flew through the land and how it was like distributed. So that's what we kind of learned about there. And that was a new concept to me, environmental racism, and how it like puts certain people at disadvantages. Yeah.
No, thank you for definitely articulating that. And I mean, Grace kind of talked about this, like when she mentioned in El Salvador, there wasn't really a lot of jobs for people. And I think Mia touched on this too. If there were no jobs, part of that has to do with how we take care of the environment too. Kelly, so I remember, just from my own like political science background, I know that there have been a lot of people who have, people who've been living in America for years who, under this current political climate, have been deported back to Jamaica. And also, pardon my French here, Jamaica is one of the countries that was constructed as a shithole country. recently. Can you talk about like what it means to be an American and standing in solidarity with the people of Jamaica?
Yeah, I think definitely we saw a lot of similarities going there. But then again, there's always going to be stuff that's different. So I think one of the things that stuck out to me the most, thinking about that and their culture and their climate, I guess, was the day that we went to the HIV/AIDS clinic. And when we were there, you know, like those are just people who are friends and family members or maybe affected themselves by the disease, and they meet every day because they, or every week because they have no one else. Like literally that society ostracizes them to the point that they can't walk down the street. And I think that that was something that resonated with us a lot, just because we were able to pray with them, we were able to sing with them, we were able to chat with them, and that solidarity was something that we saw a lot on our trip. And like we would hold hands with them and they would be so surprised because we were actually willing to like be around them and be in the same room as them. So I think their culture is definitely a few steps behind ours in a lot of ways, and that's just one.
Yeah, I think that story is really beautiful in the sense that it talks about the importance of validating every person's humanity. Um, do you feel like you had a lot of experiences like that when you were in Jamaica?
Yeah, definitely. I think going to, Michael mentioned this, but when we were at St. Bosco too, the home for, I guess they would refer to them as troubled boys, it was so funny because we came into there and the sister that was running the home was so nice, but she was very strict about warning us, like basically, you know, don't leave your bags anywhere. Like these boys, they're good boys, but they have had like hard lives that have led them to make these decisions, and you know, like they're trying to actively change that. But it was just funny because when we were getting a tour from them of the area, which is like a bunch of land that they grow fruits and vegetables on, and they have cows and pigs and stuff like that, they were just like us and they just wanted to talk to us, and they were so happy that we were there. And you know, we were like doing TikTok dances with them and like playing music and stuff like that and games and stuff. So I think just like breaking down those barriers, I guess, definitely impacted us a lot on that trip. But
I love that.
yeah, it was fun.
So I think you bring up a really good point in the idea that like violence and hardship are the result of a lot of poverty, and it's it is unfair to just say like characterize people generally as one way or another, especially when it is so often the product of systemic issues. Mia, did you see any poverty in New Mexico? You know, I think a lot of times people try to pretend like there's not a lot of poverty within our own country, but
So we served at the Good Shepherd Food Center, which is a kind of soup kitchen, you know, atmosphere where they serve lunch for people of the community that are either low income or are homeless or just want a meal that day. And so we would go in and they would serve lunch at 3 and there would be a line out the door waiting. And I think that an assumption for just a homeless population is that these people don't try to work or they don't have jobs. But Luke and I met and spoke with so many wonderful people who have 3 or 4 jobs, and you know, they're juggling life. Like they have the same struggles we do, but they, you know, have it 10 times worse. And so they would come in and they were friendly and they would talk to one another, and they were just so hardworking. And I think that that is an assumption that people have, that these people aren't hardworking and that maybe they're lazy, but they just don't have the same opportunities as us. And just hearing their stories was just so heartbreaking. Luke and I met a few of these boys who are our age, and they just explained to us how easy it was to become homeless in America. And I think people, fail to realize that they were just kicked out of their homes by their landlord, and they really didn't have a place to go. And so it can happen to anyone in a matter of seconds. And I think that being at the Good Shepherd Center, we learned that.
Yeah,
Could I add something to that?
of course.
Yeah. One of the people I met there was this guy named Skeets. I would say he was a 20-something, but he talked about like his rough upbringing and like how it led to him to make some certain decisions that wound him up in jail. And he just got out of jail like, I don't know, a week or two before we showed up. And the way that we talked together, like I was kind of uncomfortable with some of the things that we talked about. Like he talked about why he was in prison and all this other stuff. And just the look in his eyes, like he was just looking for like a connection, you know what I mean? And like, I think in our own country, in our own society, we just lose sight of that. Like we're all people, we all want to relate to each other. And like, I'm sad that I got uncomfortable about certain things. And I hope I didn't like socially distance him in that regard, but yeah, it was really profound connections,
Yeah. And I think, so I read this somewhere, but it's like, our first reaction to something is how society conditions us to feel, and our response to that reaction is how we are trying to kind of dismantle how society tells us to feel. So, obviously, like, going into spaces that are new and different, like most people have not talked to someone who's been in prison in their lifetime, right? Like, and that I'm sure for many people would feel uncomfortable and daunting because we have so many socially constructed ideas about, what it means for a person to be an ex-felon or anything. So I think, I think you also have to give yourself grace in the sense that, you saw the humanity in him, you gave him grace. You also have to give yourself grace, like it's not always easy to go to the margins. I had a question for Mike. Let me re-get it. Oh, okay. So everyone's done a little bit of talking about, how this was an immersion trip more than a mission trip. And I think sometimes a narrative that I hear a lot after people come back from these trips, like not service immersion trips, but more like mission trips where they go and build houses and that kind of thing. It's like, oh my God, that was so life-changing. People gave me more than I gave them, which like that narrative, I don't want to be unkind to anyone who kind of falls into that talk because these experiences are life-changing in a lot of ways. But I think that a lot of times that kind of narrative can fall into like, the white man's burden in the 21st century kind of thing. But what you guys have all talked about, which I think is really important, is that the way in which it changes your life is it challenges you to live differently within the systems of privilege that we all live in every day. Mike, can you tell us a little bit about like ways in which you think that you are living differently after your trip to Jamaica, the ways in which you see your future living happen differently because of this trip, any of that stuff?
I can give it a shot. So
you'll do great. I'm not hitting you guys with easy questions. I'm so sorry. Like you guys are all just like so like eloquent and profound, and your insight is also beautiful that like I feel like I just like these questions are just like coming from my heart right now. So I'm sorry if they're like crazy and deep and you were like, oh God, I thought she was gonna like ask me what we did. So sorry about that. But go for it, Mike.
All right. So how has my experience affecting the way I'm currently doing everything I'm doing?
Yeah.
So that's kind of hard because the situation we're all in currently is something that none of us were prepared for. And it's hard to have an experience where you go out and you meet people where they're at and then have that affect you and the actions you take when you're stuck in your house. So outside of current reality, just how about for the time that I got back from Jamaica until spring break, I definitely felt like I was more gracious for the things that I had, and I was probably a little bit better at talking to people and being with people that are around me. Um, in Jamaica, like the people there, you always got a hello. You always got a smile. Um, you don't expect to make best friends with the guy who's hired to drive you around or the guy that's hired to keep the grounds clean and the guy who's scraping paint at the cathedral. But for us, those were some of don't want to say for us, for me, two of the most important relationships I had were with, their names were Vin and David, two guys that we didn't necessarily go there to be with, but in reality we spent a lot of time with them, and my relationships with them really changed the experience I had in Jamaica. And so I've been a little bit more open to those unexpected relationships.
Yeah.
You don't
Beautiful. Keep
you
going.
can't just like expect that. You can't go to a place expecting an experience, because when I went to Jamaica I had no expectations. Not because I didn't want certain thing. It's not because I didn't want a certain outcome. Obviously I wanted to go and enjoy my experience, but I didn't have expectations because I had never been to Jamaica. I've never really had any encounters with Jamaican people here in the States. And so my thought process was go in with a sense of ignorance. I don't know these people. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to do it and I'm going to be there. And it worked out beautifully. The people that were on the trip were the Moyne people, both our faculty leaders, our student leaders, and the rest of the group were amazing. They made the trip what it was. Without them, I don't think I would have enjoyed it whatsoever. And if you had told me before I signed up to go to Jamaica that I would have been such good friends with some of the people on the trip, I would have told you you're kidding. That I never would have known who some of them were. And now we still have a group chat that sometimes we just say, hey, how's it going? So it's those unexpected relationships that I built in the process and while in Jamaica that have really changed the way I interact with people now.
Yeah.
You put a little bit more into a relationship. You don't expect certain things out of it. You don't expect to have relationships with certain people. You just got to let things happen. And sometimes we forget that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how it affected that portion of my life. And then maybe post-quarantine, I'm studying physics. I want to be an engineer, but what I want to do with that is cliche. I want to help people.
Right.
But I had this experience, and part of what I took from it was a reminder of why I started pursuing what I did. Not necessarily that I want to be building houses in Jamaica, which we didn't do, or not that I want to do any of these things that I was doing, but just that I want to do something that makes life better for at least one other person.
Yeah.
And that's something I've learned on my service immersion trip, but just as a hallmark of, I've been Jesuit educated for almost 7 years straight now.
Mm-hmm.
And I cannot separate that Jesuit education, the core values that are on top of the academics, from who I am. It's just been instilled in me because that's all I've really known since I was 13 or 14.
Yeah.
So it's always just wanting to do a little bit more for another person. And I think that's how Jamaica and Jesuit education, because I don't know if this is still technically the week that we're celebrating. I don't know.
We're like going from like Ignatian Heritage Week to Ignatian Solidarity Week, so
I don't know which week I'm technically in. Saturday.
You're in both.
Honestly, my calendar is not by days anymore. It is by when assignments are due. Most days I don't know what day it is unless I get a ding to go to class.
Yeah, feel that.
But the transition, but you cannot separate Ignatian Heritage from solid, like you cannot separate those four cornerstones, and that's just affecting the relationships I have now, what I hope to do in the future. It kind of just affects everything, and I'm not attempting to speak for anybody else who is on this podcast or anyone else who's gone to Lemoyne or a Jesuit school, but I feel like generally people who are Jesuit educated have that feeling.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. You said you're like, oh, as cliche as it sounds, I just want to help people. But I don't think that's cliche at all. I think like if you were to survey, if you could potentially survey every single person within our generational group, the overwhelming response, not to say that like people who are Jesuit educated are the only people to say that, but I think the overwhelming response is that people want to make money, like that is usually the driving factor that I see from a lot of people our age. And obviously it doesn't, no one is a monolith, nothing like that, but it is nice to know that I feel like at Lemoyne specifically, I'm surrounded by a community of people who really want to build a better world, not, just do something for themselves, which is really cool. Mike brought up a really good question that I'm going to throw to Grace. No pressure, Grace. But this is something that I've been personally struggling with too, is it's like this idea of like, how do you do and perform social justice and solidarity while social distancing, while, we're all caught up in our houses and you can't really go to these places?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're in very unprecedented times too. So like, I think this is all a real day by day learning experience. But I think that is something that's really important, because I think too, when these sort of when something like this, like a virus, that seems inescapable and is affecting everyone, I think sometimes the thing to think about too is like who has the most disadvantage at this time, and who is the most vulnerable at this time, especially to like a sickness like this. And generally, a lot of that time it'll be people who are on the margins or in poverty and are ignored by society. So I think for me, especially coming back from El Salvador, and we learned a lot. Immigration issues were a huge aspect of that trip, and learning about why people are leaving the country, what they're fleeing from, and the process of coming into the United States, and how that is a huge hardship. And I think, though, what has been important is looking at what we're experiencing right now, and addressing that this is really difficult for everyone, but also looking at too, I just saw an article the other day about how social distancing is a privilege, because for people in like refugee camps that doesn't exist. And same for people right now who are undocumented citizens, or who are trying to come across the border and are now in detention centers, how that really isn't something that they can do. So, the virus, they may be subjected to it more than others. So I think coming from something like this immersion experience in El Salvador, and from all of our places that we went and visited, I think that's something that I have taken with me, is that I have tried to think more about the people I had spent that time with and how this may be affecting them. And I don't know, I don't know what I can do right now in quarantine, like how you do that. And so I think for me, the most important thing has been thinking about those people who more or less are being forgotten right now, and trying to talk about that, or just, have that in the forefront of your mind. Because I think, it's really hard right now, because we're not supposed to be doing much. So like, it's kind of difficult, but I think that has been something that's been different for me. And I may not have really thought about, without being able to hear the experiences of other people in El Salvador.
Yeah, I read an article recently that said by performing social distancing, you're doing an act of social justice in the sense that if we stay in our homes, we are doing what we can to flatten the curve, which other people aren't.
Absolutely.
And in that sense, we're protecting other people that are more vulnerable in those situations. So that's what I've been telling myself.
Absolutely. I think this is in the whole, social distancing and wearing masks, all of that. I think absolutely you're being in solidarity with people when you're doing that. So I think that is so true. That's a huge part of this.
And one other thing that I've been thinking about specifically in terms of like what social justice looks like in quarantine, I know that we've talked a little bit about how like charity is different from justice, but I've thought a lot about performing acts of charity to enable justice in the sense that if I can't leave my house, but I can give my money to people that are essential workers and have to leave their house to perform acts of justice, like, it's spreading the Jesuit values without leaving my house, hopefully. I don't know. That's what I'm at least telling myself. Luke is smiling, so he's either laughing at me or he agrees. It sounds like he agrees. So before we wrap up, I'm just hoping, Mia and Kelly and maybe Luke, do you guys want to just share like one last story that you didn't get to tell that is gonna, that has stayed with you?
Yeah, I'll go first.
Okay,
so
cool.
We visited this community called the Enlace Comunitario, and it's a domestic violence support center. And it focused on shaping, policy and conducting outreach and just raising awareness for the Latino communities that are normally, underrepresented. And this community has helped over 700 families. So what it does is, right now they don't have shelters for people that are being abused, but they get them educated and they provide them meals. And I think that right now that is a really important place that I've been thinking about, because with everyone being home, domestic violence has increased around the world because people are at home with their abusers, and there's stress of unemployment and food insecurity and unpaid bills. And that's just a place from New Mexico that when we got to meet people from there that I've been thinking a lot about during this coronavirus, because I'm just wondering how, they're handling the situation with, the double amount of people being, stuck home with their abusers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that brings up a really important point to go back to kind of the question Grace answered, is just like paying attention is an act of social justice too, right? Like not turning away. Kelly, did you have a story you wanted to tell us?
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily a story, I don't think, but I think Michael would agree that this is like something that has resonated with us a lot, is the fact that we now are still keeping in touch with the people that we met when we were there. So one of our trip leaders, Sue Wetzel, she texts us in our group chat, like, I don't know, maybe once every 2 weeks or something, a screenshot of the text that she gets from our bus driver when we were in Jamaica, and he sends her these texts like, I'm thinking of you, I hope you guys are safe, praying for you. He sends her like these prayers for us, and I think for me, every time I see those, it's just a reminder of, that like solidarity and the connections that you can build with people across these margins. And yeah, just like the hope that you can build from that. I think every time we see those, we just smile. So,
yeah. Well, I think the really cool thing that has like been really cool for me to hear you guys talking is like all of you have said a name of someone at some point throughout the past hour. Like you clearly like remember these people have deeply impacted in your lives, and it comes across in just your passion for talking about solidarity and social justice. Luke, do you want to tell a story?
So I guess one of my favorite parts of the trip was St. Edwin's Church. I was working with these two local guys, Johnny, and I want to say the other guy's name was Chris. And like at first I was kind of like shy, and we were breaking up like grass from the dirt because they need to uproot it and make it better because the church was undergoing massive construction, and all this construction was being carried out by volunteers of the church. And like we just started talking about anything really, like simple stupid conversations like what's the best fast food place in Albuquerque, or what kind of music you listen to, or what do you guys do here for fun. And like that kind of like broke down that barrier, like that preconceived notion that, you know, they're on the other side of the country, they're in a completely different culture than me, we're all the same, you know. Like that's what I really like took away from that. And like they reminded me of people from my own church, because like my church is like heavily volunteer driven, and like they do a bunch of shit, they do a bunch of stuff for the church stuff. Yeah,
That's right. That's what you said. You're doing great, Luke.
sorry.
I don't want to make anybody else say anything they don't want to, but is there anything that like anybody wants to say? I just want to make sure everyone has. Luke is mortified right now. Luke, I can edit this.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I'll take care of it. I'll take care of it. Is there any other stories people want to tell?
I'm good.
All right.
One more thing, I just thought of this because I'm trying to think of like an actual story with the relationship that we had with our bus driver, Vin. I mean, he would take us on these little excursions. I mean, I don't know if that's technically allowed in the whole Moyne service trip thing, but he would take us to all these places that he thought we would like. And one thing that I remember that always sticks out to me when I think of him is one day we were going back from one of these little excursions, and it was like probably everything in Jamaica is like an hour to an hour and 15 minutes at least away from each other. So we're heading back from one of these places. I don't know where it is, but he wanted to show us his house and where he lived. So we're driving down the street and he pulls over at his house. I forget if he had to get something or not, and then he turns to us in the bus, and we're all crammed in the back of the bus, and he's like, does anybody need to use the bathroom? Do you guys need anything? Like, do you guys need food or anything? And I think that like generosity and just like openness of like literally bringing all of these strangers that he just has to drive from place to place, like, and welcoming them like into his home is something that always makes me smile. So
I love that. And I've also thought about specifically like when you and Mike have been telling stories, and I know not everyone who listens to this is Christian, but I'm coming from my own Catholic perspective, is like I've felt like so many of your experiences parallel different Bible allegories, especially like in the New Testament, like welcoming the stranger into your house, you know, holding hands with the leper, that kind of thing. That's been something that's really been beautiful for me out of this conversation. So thank you for that. Mia, did you want to say something? I don't want to like put you on the spot, but
yeah, I just really recommend going on a service trip, especially through Moyne Campus Ministry, because they do just a really wonderful job of, you know, planning the entire trip. And the people that you go on the trips with from Moyne are just, you know, such wonderful people, and everybody is there because they want to help, you know, other communities and other people. And I think that's my favorite part of going on these trips. So Fiona, if you ever get the chance, I really think you should go.
Yeah, no, okay, so I really want to, and now I even want to go more so. I'm not gonna say where a future trip might be going. I can tell you guys after we stop like recording, but Alice has given me some insight into some future trips that sound very exciting and everyone should be paying attention to, because I really want to go. So I just want to thank you guys all for showing up today, spending an hour of your Saturday doing this. You know, this is kind of like a very awkward platform, just in the sense that there's a lot of us, and it's hard to do this when you're not in person and you can't like really read like the body cues of everyone. But I really feel like we made the most out of this, and you're all so gracious and so kind, and you all put up with my rambling, unfiltered questions. And I'm really grateful because you brought such an intersectional perspective to this, at looking at the ways injustices are connected, and you really, I feel like, really gave us all a great idea of what it means to be a person of solidarity for and with others. So thank you guys so much for joining us on our podcast today, and I hope you guys have a great week.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much for tuning in to today's episode. If you're interested in hearing more conversations about immigration justice, connect with us online via the campus ministry social media accounts. Leave us a comment on Instagram, send us a tweet, DM us, or shoot us an email, whatever works for you. On that matter, if there are any topics you'd love to listen to a conversation about, again, please just connect with us. In today's episode, we talked a lot about intersectionality, and for me, that means no social justice issue is off the table. Let me know what you wanted to hear us talk about next. Thanks again to Kelly and Mike and Mia and Luke and Grace for joining us today. They are some of the most incredible people out there. I am so lucky to know them, and our community is better off because they are a part of it. We'll have a new episode out next Tuesday, and until then, stay safe, wash your hands, and tell people you love them. Can't wait to talk with you all soon.